So your international organizations are actually, I consider them quite interesting. Maybe you won't find them interesting. We'll see. But there's something that do come up quite frequently, so they are important to know about. So we'll go through each of them one at a time. So we'll start with the World Trade Organization, or the WTO. Important to know, I guess, with international organizations, some key facts about them, their role, whether they're good at it, whether they're bad at it, and also, I guess, some examples of things they've actually done. So the WTO was formed in 1995, and it was the first international organization that actually had power to enforce trade agreements. So as of 2019, there was 164 member states with 19 states negotiating. And the role of the WTO was to liberalize trade by encouraging free trade policies. So, for example, they reduced protection in agricultural industries and in the EU and the USA. So the WTO is good in that it actually does have power to enforce different policies. They promote non-discrimination in trading policies. So essentially, protection concessions granted to one country should be granted to all. So essentially, any, not even just protection, just concessions granted to one country should be granted to every single country to promote equality between trading economies so that no economy is disadvantaged based on the WTO's actions. They also have a big role, and probably the most important feature of the WTO is to dispute or to resolve disputes in trade. So a country suffering economic harm because another country has not completed with the WTO or complied with the WTO ruling can lodge a plaint with the WTO. WTO panel will then hear the dispute and make a ruling between the two economies that must be followed. So, like I said, probably the most important feature of the WTO, because it is one of the only governing bodies that actually has power to do something about the dispute, rather than just be you should do this. No, the WTO actually can enforce that ruling. The WTO can be considered effective in resolving disputes between smaller countries. Keyword being here between smaller countries. Because in 2011, there's something known as the Doha Round, which, if you are interested, and I do encourage you to have a little bit of a Google search on the Doha Round. So essentially, they tried to, in 2011, advance trade liberalization. However, there was slow progress made to the Doha Round, which meaning nations such as Australia have created more bilateral and regional trade agreements in that time because of the slow progress to the Doha Round. So yeah, important to consider with each of your international organizations, are they actually effective or not? One of the most common questions you'll get about international organizations will be about effectiveness of these organizations and whether or not they actually did anything. So the next one we're going to look at is the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, which was created in July of 1994 and has 189 member nations. So the role of the IMF is to maintain international financial stability, particularly in the forex. So keywords here is maintaining financial stability. So the IMF lends money to member countries that are having trouble meeting their financial obligations to other member countries. And in return, these debtor countries must undertake economic reforms by the IMF. Now, this is a really interesting thing to look at in the fact that the IMF is essentially saying, okay, we're not part of your country, but if you're going to take money from us, you have to let us have some economic control over your economy. So it's a really interesting thing to look at and how effective it actually is when the IMF tries to undertake economic reform. So in a financial crisis, the IMF's role is to minimize the crisis by developing rescue packages to help stabilize the economy. So the IMF will require a country to change their economic policies before they receive assistance, which is, I think, a really key thing to talk about when you're talking about the IMF, that the change has to happen before they receive assistance, which in a lot of cases is not sustainable and it's not efficient to make a change in such short time and then receive financial assistance. So other banks require that these countries adopt these policies before they lend, and most countries have adopted similar economic strategies as well. So in talking about the effectiveness of the IMF, they did play a really significant role in restoring stability during the GFC by injecting $250 billion into the global economy to promote liquidity. So in case you guys don't remember, liquidity is pretty much like how easy can you actually access your money. So things like having money in a bank, or like having cash, very liquid. You can very easily get your money. Things like houses, not very liquid because you can't really that easily sell a house. So that's pretty much liquidity. The IMF just pretty much injected a lot of money into the economy so that there'd be a lot of money for economies to access when they needed to have stimulus packages within their economies. So the IMF pledged to have a bigger role in the global financial system as a result of the GFC. And they provided approximately $280 billion to member nations in COVID-19 loans as well. However, like with pretty much every organization, you're always going to have the however. The sovereign debt crisis in 2011 to 12 meant that the IMF and the EU provided bailout packages to Greece, Portugal, and Ireland worth over $600 billion. But they've faced a lot of criticism of specifically protecting Europe's monetary union and its bank, and it faced some really big criticism about essentially favouring the European economies. So if you want to talk about that in your essays, really important statistic to think about is that from 2011 to 2014, 80% of the IMF's lending went to just three EU economies, so Greece, Portugal, Ireland. And when you consider the fact that they are fairly sustained or established economies, you can sort of start to see where the criticism of favoritizing the European economies comes in there. So in return from a lot of that criticism, the IMF structural adjustments for the EU were to cut government spending, raise taxes, sell government assets, and decrease the size of the government workforce. However, the IMF did then report that the measures that they tried to implement worsened the collapse of Greece. So GDP fell significantly and unemployment in Greece rose to 25% when it was only predicted to be 15%. So this is sort of what I was talking about before when I was talking about it's really interesting when the IMF tries to implement economic reforms in a country that it doesn't generally have all the information on. It's really interesting when the IMF tries to establish these policies without consulting economic officials and economists in that country itself, which leads to things like the further collapse of a country such as Greece. Even though the IMF spent a lot of money on Greece and they tried to implement these policies, ultimately it still led to a worse outcome because the IMF typically doesn't have all of the information and doesn't have the best interests of that economy and that country and its people at heart. So if you're going to talk about the IMF, that's a really good, disadvantage to talk about as well. So then we've got the World Bank, which was created in 1944 after the role shifted from the European reconstruction post-war to addressing poverty and encouraging development. Now, important that you remember the role of the World Bank is economic development, not economic growth. So the World Bank is focused on granting loans to developing countries to reduce poverty and encourage development within these economies. Okay, super important. World Bank is about development, not growth. So the focus of the World Bank is to fund investment in infrastructure, reduce poverty, help countries to adjust their economies to the demands of globalization, and it's funded by contributions from member countries as well as from its own borrowing in the global financial market, which has a little bit of stipulations to that, but we'll talk about that in a second. So the World Bank aids developing nations by providing soft loans, which are essentially loans at little or no interest to developing countries for infrastructure, attracting private sector investment, especially to fund infrastructure, and providing grants as well. With the World Bank, it is important to notice that there is funds, it's funded by contributions from member countries. So to some degree, there can be political involvement in where that money goes. If you look up the World Bank and its structure, you'll see that this is not such a pressing problem at the moment, but there is the potential for political involvement in where that money goes. So for example, let's say the US is funding a particular project. If they have particular economic ties or political ties to a country, they may choose that they want their money to go somewhere or not another place. So it's not such a pressing issue at the moment, but it is something to consider when you are thinking about the World Bank. Probably the most well-known international organisation amongst economic students before you start studying these is the UN. Established in 1945, 193 member countries, which is more countries than any other political or economic organisation. It does have a very broad agenda. So international peace and security, environment and refugee protection, poverty and development, international law, global health issues. I think there's also they have a particular group that helps what do we do if we find that aliens exist. The UN does a whole bunch of stuff. For economics, you just want to focus on these ones, in particular, the things that impact economic growth and economic development as your big focuses for the UN. You would say that they can be effective, that they create international agreements to enforce human rights and political freedoms. There's the UN Global Aims that I'm sure a lot of you have seen to help reduce poverty and inequality between 2015 and 2030. And they build on the Millennium Development Goals that saw a reduction in the percentage of people living on less than $1 a day from 29% in 1990 to 14% in 2015. So that's an actual example of something the UN has done that could help you talk about why they're effective. You could also talk about how they can be ineffective in that particular countries can essentially veto decisions. You can talk about how the UN has an army that doesn't really have any power to actually do anything. So there are pros and cons to the UN as well. Next, we've got the OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. OECD is where you're going to get a lot of your statistics about the HDI from when you're talking about economic development. So the OECD is an international organization that includes 35 advanced economies, and it comprises the main industrial economies of the world, with the primary goal to promote policies to achieve the highest sustainable economic growth, employment, and rising living standards in member countries, whilst also maintaining fiscal stability. So the OECD is essentially just a forum for discussion and coordination of policies rather than an enactor of these policies and discussions. In 2008, the OECD proposed the worldwide macroeconomic stimulus package. Again, that is just a proposal, they can't actually do anything about it, although in Australia it did lead to a $52 billion stimulus package in Australia. So the OECD is really good for discussing economic issues, and it can be really effective in then leading to policies being put in place in different economies. However, the OECD will not actually definitively lead to the introduction of policies in Australia. So final few things we'll talk about the G7 and the G20 in terms of international organizations. Your G7 is the US, the UK, Germany, Canada, Japan, and Italy. You may notice that's actually only 6 economies because there was one economy that was removed from the G7. So the G7 has effectively operated as the economic council of the world's wealthiest nations. They meet annually to discuss conditions in the global economy, and its agenda includes political issues as well as current priorities such as climate change as well. So the significance of the G7 is declining because it doesn't include countries that have grown in economic importance, such as China and Brazil. It actually only includes, you'll see here, countries that were traditionally seen as the big powerhouses of the economy. So the G7 is declining for that particular reason in importance. So there also has been recent attempts to expand this group to including 5 developing countries that have become known as the Outreach 5. So that's Brazil, China, India, Mexico, South Africa. And again, this used to be the G8, but was expelled. Russia was expelled because of their violation of Ukraine's sovereignty in 2014. Now, similar to the G7, another forum you've got is the G20. So it includes the G8 and some of the emerging economies such as China, Brazil, Mexico, India, and Australia. And it does cover 80% of global GDP and 2/3 of the global population. So the role of the G20 has been centered on addressing changes necessary after the GFC. And they also help to form an agreement on how to deal with global recession. So during the GFC, the G20 held meetings to ensure macroeconomic policy, specifically expansionary monetary policy and fiscal policy, were coordinated throughout the world to sort of give a united approach to the issues that were being faced, which did help the world return from GWP growth rate of 0.9% in 2009 to a GWP growth rate of 5.4% in 2010. This being said, it is important to note with both the G7 and the G20 that they are just forums. They cannot enact anything, and being a member nation of the G7 or the G20 does not mean that you actually have to do anything with what's discussed in those forums. Whilst a lot of economies do then go on to implement different things that were discussed at those forums, it is not a requirement of being part of those organizations that you actually have to do anything with what's discussed. Okay, so to finish off our discussion of international organizations, I've just got a few multiple choice questions. So this is from the 2019 HSC, and I'll just give you guys a minute to have a go at this one. And just if you're watching live, type your answer in the chat. Otherwise, I'll reveal the answer in a minute. Alrighty, so the answer to this one is D. The G20 is best described as a government forum for the coordination of economic policies. And a second practice question, of which institution or forum is Australia not a member? I'll give you guys just another minute to think about this one as well. Alrighty, and the answer to this one is A, ASEAN, or the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. But Australia is a member of the G20, the IMF, and the OECD.